Hello and welcome to Epochs, where I'm joined by Bo, as always, and I'm Josh. And we are going to be doing part 3 of Operation Market Garden. And now I've watched the film as well, I'm all the more excited to actually talk about what happened, because, of course, film being a film, there's probably things that aren't necessarily true about it. And it's a very interesting operation from what I gathered from the film. And, of course, we've been building up to this in the previous two, so I'm interested to see how it plays out.
What were your overall impressions? Because it was,
Really
it was
good
critically
film.
acclaimed. Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, the acting is fantastic in it. Some of the action scenes for the late 70s are really good. I mean, some of the sound doesn't necessarily age quite as well. You've got the sort of old 1960s Wild West revolver shot sound effect going on in the background. But that's part of the charm, I think, of it. But no, I thought it was quite a faithful attempt at portraying war, if you know what I mean. Like, they weren't trying to sell a narrative necessarily. They were trying to depict war as being an unpleasant thing. Mm. And they certainly did that.
And it's 1977, so there's no CGI in it, remotely, nothing. So when you see thousands of guys parachuting out of hundreds of planes over Holland, that's just real.
It is very impressive, some of the shots in there. The fact there is no CGI. And I remember seeing the scene at the start of the film where you've got large columns of people, and I was just like, oh, wow, well, that's clearly done in real life, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's an amazing feat of cinematography in all sorts of ways. Of course, it was Dickie Attenborough, Lord Richard Attenborough, that directed it. But it's great storytelling, I think, because I rewatched it not too long ago. I've seen it loads and loads of times. But I rewatched it not too long ago just to refresh myself and to... because in this Epochs, I'll talk a bit about what is in the film and isn't in the book and vice versa and stuff like that, what is and isn't real, if you like. I was just absolutely enthralled by it, even though I've seen it, like, I don't know, maybe 10 times, maybe not quite that much, but I've seen it multiple times. It used to be on TV all the time. Well, not all the time, but because it's kind of glorious for the British, and it doesn't show the Nazis to be absolute psychopathic monsters. Because of those two things, they won't put it on TV much anymore. It's kind of glorious in some ways, from our point of view. So, of course, they won't put that on TV, but...
One of the things that did happen was that the version I had didn't have a dub for the Germans, and therefore I had to kind of just interpret what they were saying, but you can normally get away with that.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
It doesn't at all.
That was an artistic decision, in my opinion, and most people's opinion, a very brave artistic decision.
Yeah, it is brave.
Because you also see Dutch families talking to each other in Dutch. And, it was a deliberate decision.
I thought I just had a dodgy version.
No.
But you can kind of pick up words.
You can totally understand just from their... Well, it forces you to sort of read their body language and their face.
That's exactly
what I was doing. You don't know every word,
yeah.
but you can pick up the odd thing. Yeah, it's great. I thought that was a very good, brave decision.
I like it when a film takes the time to treat its audience with maturity. And that's certainly what it did there, in that it didn't force down your throat some horrific dub where all the Germans are speaking English, or give you subtitles, which I don't really mind subtitles, to be honest. Quite like a subtitled film normally, because it doesn't have to rest on its laurels too much.
And the pacing is great. I mean, it's Cornelius Ryan as well as Dickie Attenborough responsible for that. But I just thought it was a bit something like a masterclass in storytelling. You know, it's like if they were personified. You know, it's like an alpha Chad. And if something like, I don't know, one of the Transformers films is like a little special needs baby, it's like, it's pathetic, it's really embarrassingly bad and just all sorts of wrong. Whereas it's like it's gone haywire. It's like their ability to tell a story has been just completely inverted or something.
I think it's that they're not trying to sell a story or tell a story even, although that was a good Freudian slip. They're trying to create spectacle in the bad films. They're just saying, look at this thing, then look at this thing. It's like you've got no cognitive life whatsoever. You're just a vegetable drooling, like at the end of Clockwork Orange. That sort of thing.
You have to have everything explained to you perhaps more than once. Whereas how good is it? I watched a film not too long ago from the 60s, The Spy That Came In From the Cold. Don't know if you know that one. It's very early 60s, black and white, Richard Burton. And in that, there's loads and loads of things that they don't explain. but it still works, still makes sense because you're sort of an adult person with an adult mind and you know the world a bit and you don't need everything explained. A little sideways look or a sound which is a bit ambiguous, that's okay. You don't have to have everything spelled out to you. You don't need a bit of dialogue saying, this is what just happened, remember?
Well, when it comes to films, my favourite film is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which tells you basically nothing. It's like, not even going to have a narrator, we're not going to let any of it happen. You're just going to go on a ride and then you're going to get off at the end.
Okay, so the novel, Cornelius Ryan's novel, actually, sorry, it's not a novel, it's not fictional, but his book, the first sort of third of it or more is what we talked about in the last two epochs. In the film, they don't do any of that, as I mentioned. They just start, as you saw it starts
Straight with the action, more or less.
with Boyer Browning basically explaining it to his brigadiers, Urquhart, who's played by Sean Connery, and then there's the leader of the 82nd Airborne, a General Gavin, played by Ryan O'Neill, and then the Polish General Sosabowski by Gene Hackman, who does do a dodgy accent, doesn't he?
He does a bit, yeah.
It's a really bad accent, actually, but fair enough.
Comes across as a good character, though, in the film.
It's still, despite the accent, it's still good acting performance, I think, and his character's a good one. Really
The person who did the Dutch accent was terrible.
Who's that? What bit's that?
There was one of the Americans has like a Dutch sidekick for a bit.
That's right, yeah.
And it's like someone trying to impersonate a Dutch person without ever hearing them.
Right, yeah.
It's like, they kind of just this generic continental European accent.
Or Dick Van Dyke trying to do a Cockney accent. Cool, blimey. Yeah, it's really bad. It's like, have you ever heard London accent? But anyway, I actually like Dick Van Dyke. I don't know why I'm picking on him there. Anyway, the other brigadier is the Brigadier General is the head of the 101st, General Maxwell Taylor, a sort of a famous airborne man. And so that's what we need to get into then, the action. So a little bit about the structure. Different armies are structured differently and over time. But in our case, in this case, in the Allies in World War II, and it is often the case, but if someone really knows their stuff, they might say, that's not always true. But anyway, you have a commanding officer, commanding general, and then underneath that you'll have heads of division. And a division is quite a big number of men, usually a few thousand men. Urquhart, Taylor, and Gavin are all sort of divisional level generals, and we've got essentially three stories. There's this, four even. But there's the story of the 101st, what they do in the southernmost pocket round Eindhoven. A whole different story, really, kind of. I mean, they're connected. About what the 82nd do around Nijmegen, and then of course up in Arnhem, the British Airborne. Sort of three different stories. And of course, there's Market Garden. There's the Market Forces, the ground forces, our 30 Corps under Horrocks. So sort of three, or even arguably sort of four different stories going on. And in the film, I think they did quite a very good job, really, of sort of describing that and showing it all.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Other than a couple of times where I rewatched it just a few days ago, there's a bit where Robert Redford almost single-handedly takes the bridge at Nijmegen, doesn't he? And you remember that? So almost single-handedly does it. Of course, that's not what really happened. But that was the only case where, because I know the story inside out, I'm like, they're at Nijmegen. But you could be forgiven for thinking they're at Arnhem, because the actual bridge itself, looks almost identical. It's very, very similar. So it's like, wait, I thought Anthony Hopkins was at Arnhem. Now it's Robert Redford on his own. What's going on? But other than that, it's a very small criticism, because in a nearly 3-hour-long film, to say one little detail, still amazingly good.
I mean, maybe the bridges did look similar. I mean, I don't know what...
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
So that is fair. Little bits and bobs, like there's a character, Elliot Gould plays a character, and he's sort of not the real character. So, for example, the Germans blow up a bridge at Sonn. There's a small town called Sonn, north of Eindhoven, and the Germans blew that bridge. And it was actually a guy called Wierzbowski, an American. That's his name, Wierzbowski.
Sounds like it should be one name.
Well, it is. Sorry, that is his surname, Wierzbowski.
Oh, that's his surname.
Yeah,
it's not,
yeah.
I was going to say his first name being Wiz.
No. His surname is Wierzbowski, and so they've changed. There's a few little things like that where they've changed it around, I guess, for the screenplay for whatever reason. But other than a couple of little things like that, and when we get to more, I'll mention them. But mostly, it's really, really accurate. As a World War II film, A Bridge Too Far is known for being sort of hyper accurate, to the point where there's one bit in it where if you didn't know, it would pass you by. There's one bit in it, literally one shot, where you see Maxwell D. Taylor, the commanding officer of the 101st, the Screaming Eagles. You see him sort of in the doorway of one of the aeroplanes, on the transports, and he sort of looks out the door and salutes. And there's a real picture of General Maxwell, and it's just a perfect recreation of that picture. It's sort of kind of his most famous picture, and they sort of recreate it perfectly. And there's loads of things like that. Like, they went to extraordinary lengths to make sure everything looked authentic, and filmed it in Holland, in Arnhem. For example, where they do the scenes where they're dropping thousands of paratroopers over Holland, they do it over the same drop zones and landing zones in Holland. And filmmakers, there's a documentary, good documentary all about it. They said there's no real need to do that. You could have filmed that over southern England. It wouldn't have made any difference, essentially. But Richard Attenborough and other people were like, no, we want to make it hyper real, super real, as real as we possibly can.
I think you do have an obligation when you're covering something of historic significance that isn't really too far back into history, where you've got people who can remember it quite clearly, certainly in 1977.
It's only like 30 odd years, isn't it?
Yeah, that you do it correctly and accurately and depict it in a way which does it justice. Because then if you do it poorly, well, you're disrespecting the people who took part in it, aren't you?
Right, yes. The first thing that springs to mind is Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards.
Yeah.
So it's making no effort whatsoever. I mean, I'm sure the uniforms are accurate and stuff like that, but as for being authentic or anything like that, obviously it's completely out the window.
Well, it's a flight of his fantasy,
Yeah,
really.
sure,
The
I'm
same
not-
as Django
it's okay.
Unchained, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's fine. It's just a different form of
Certainly not a
storytelling.
history movie.
Right, exactly. Whereas this is, and loads of the dialogue in it is taken straight out of the book, which is itself highly researched. Well, it's just correct, really. I hope it's not too much of an exaggeration just to be able to just rely on anything Cornelius Ryan says, really. It kind of is, because he's known as... Well, that's one other thing I'd like to mention, just super quick. There's lots of books about Operation Market Garden, about the battle for Arnhem. There's loads of books. I mean, there's The Battle for Arnhem by Christopher Hibbert.
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar with him.
And it gets mentioned a couple of times in Cornelius
I think
Ryan's
I've
book.
read him talk about the French Revolution before.
Oh, he's a very famous historian, yeah. Anthony Beevor, if you ever heard that name, is an extremely famous historian, up there with sort of Hugh Trevor Roper or something. Sort of really, really famous 20th century historian. He wrote one, just Arnhem. People that were there was a guy called Dean Drummond, who at the time was a very young officer. I think he was a captain or a major, even though he was like 23 or 24 years old. He went on to become a major general as an older man. He wrote a book about it, a whole book about it, Arrows of Fortune. I've not read that, I must admit. It gets referenced and mentioned a fair bit in A Bridge Too Far. There's loads of books. There's a Street in Arnhem by Robert Kershaw. There's lots of them. But most people sort of consider A Bridge Too Far to be, as I say, one of the best. So let's get into it, where I've done, hopefully set the scene. I haven't bored anyone too much with the degree to which I've explained to setting the scene. But so let's just get into it. There's a scene in the film, and I put a clip in the first episode of this, where you see Horrocks on stage telling 30 Corps, telling all the tankers what the plan is. And he picks out Joe Vandeleur, who's an Irishman. Vandeleur doesn't sound very Irish, does it? It keeps saying he's an Irishman, but Michael Caine plays it very posh. I guess he was that type of Anglo-Irish aristocracy, where they're Irish, but they're actually very posh English sounding.
I was a
guess
bit
it was
confused by that. Was he meant to be Northern Irish and like some sort of British Empire loyalist? I don't know.
I think it is that thing, the sort of Anglo-Irish aristocracy, where, your family seat is in, like, County Cork or something.
That being said,
but you're really posh English, basically.
I've seen old archival footage from the mid-60s of Dublin, and they're talking to people, and they sound a lot more English than they do now.
Right.
It's almost like the Irish nationalism forced out the English accent, and they became more and more Irish sounding.
Maybe, yeah. Well,
It's highly possible.
one thing that springs to mind is it's obviously a couple of 100 years ago, but the Duke of Wellington is an Irishman. He's Irish. His family seat is in Ireland, but he was, of course, just English aristocracy. Really, he didn't speak with any sort of Irish accent, not remotely. I think it must have been that. But anyway, Joe Vandeleur, who's played by Michael Caine in the film, and there's a great bit when Horrocks ribs him for looking like a peasant. Do you remember that? Yeah. He says, if you're ever captured by the Germans, they'll probably let you go because they'll mistake you for a wretched peasant by your attire. Well, that's true. Apparently, that actually exactly happened. Well, as I say, a lot of the dialogue in the film is taken directly from what really happened. But just a quick point on that, that scene where they're in that theatre and he's telling all the senior officers what the plan's going to be for like 1 or 2 days' time. That's only like 10 miles behind the front lines. It's right on the Dutch-Belgian border. A decent artillery piece can fire 10 miles, no problem. Just imagine if the Luftwaffe, because, the Allied Air Force has got almost complete air dominance, certainly by daylight. But imagine if one Stuka had dropped a bomb on that theatre at that moment, or one big artillery shell had fallen on that theatre at that time. It's just surprising to me that it was so close to enemy lines. But anyway, where they gathered there, I really like this paragraph where he explains about what they look like, about their attire, and about that joke where he says he would mistake you for a peasant. Here's a line that says, it was a colourful, exuberant group that reminded Brigadier Hubert Essame, commanding officer of the 214th Brigade, 43rd Wessex Infantry Division, of an army assembly at a point-to-point race or a demonstration on Salisbury Plain in time of peace. He was fascinated by the colourful dress of the commanders. There was a striking variety of headgear. No one had a steel helmet, but berets of many colours bore the proud badges of famous regiments, among them the Irish Grenadier, Coldstream, Scots, Welsh and Royal Horse Guards, the Royal Army Service Corps and Royal Artillery. There was a real casualness about everyone's attire. Essame noted that most commanders were dressed in snipers' smocks, parachutists' jackets and jeep coats over brightly coloured slacks, corduroys, riding breeches or even jodhpurs. Instead of ties, many sported ascots or scarves of various colours. So there you go. It all seems very...
Hodgepodge?
Yeah, or rather that they're all old public school boys, basically. In fact, there's another bit, didn't get it here, but they're like, some of them are even wearing like school scarves and things when they'd been to Harrow or Rugby or Eton or whatever. And, you go to the right school, you go to the right training academy or university or whatever, and so they sort of, yeah, there's a real camaraderie between them, even though they're, from all different regiments and things. And the tankers, apparently it was their thing to wear a green scarf. And in the film, you see Michael Caine wearing the green scarf. And apparently, again, for whatever reason, the tankers took uniform not all that seriously. It's funny how some different parts of different services take it more or less seriously. So for example, your classic infantryman, there's going to be a lot of spit and polish and everything has to be absolutely squared away. Special forces guys, not so much. In Bravo to Zero, Andy McNabb talks about how only normal army guys care about, having perfectly pressed trousers or anything.
Well, it's irrelevant to the job at hand, isn't it? You've got to be a task-oriented mind to do well in the military.
Although an opposite to that is... Sir Frederick Browning, Boy Browning, again played by Dirk Bogarde. Apparently he was just immaculately turned out at absolutely all times, no matter what. It was absolutely, like he'd wear sort of spotless grey kid gloves or his shoes or his pistol holster would be sort of that highly lacquered, highly polished. You could eat your dinner off it, sort of spick and span. So some people. In fact,
appreciate it though.
there was a story. There's a bit where he said to Urquhart, months long before Operation Market Garden. He said to him something like, "Get rid of those trews. They're like, get rid of those get some decent trousers. Smarten yourself up, man. Who do you think you are?" He would have been more polite than that. But yeah, so that's when that scene where Horrocks tells everyone that this is a story you can tell your grandchildren, and mightily bored they shall be. Again, just a great. It's just great storytelling. It's difficult, I think, to not be interested in that. Like I've sat down with different people over the years and watched that film, and some people are absolutely enthralled by it, and others not so much. But I just can't help. Like you said, the time went really quickly when you watched it.
Well, yeah, it's a 3-hour film, and it's just like, is that over already? Blimey.
Yeah, it moves on quickly, doesn't it? All right, so maybe let's start describing the lift itself. So it's one of the most gigantic. Well, it's the biggest airlift ever attempted, and it had to take place over 3 days because it's just not possible to do it all in one day, despite all the money and material at the disposal of the Allies. It still wasn't anywhere near enough, because what they were trying to do is sort of gigantic. And we'll get into that it might have worked a lot better if we'd been able to do it all in one go. But so anyway, here's a great one of my favourite paragraphs in the whole book. It says, "The thunder of the huge formations was ear-splitting. Around British glider bases in Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire, horses and cattle panicked and bolted in the fields. In southern and eastern England, thousands of people watched in amazement. In some villages and towns, road traffic jammed and came to a halt. Passengers in speeding trains crowded on one another to stare out of windows. Everywhere people gaped, dumbfounded, at a spectacle no one had ever seen before. The mightiest airborne force in history was off the ground and heading for its targets." It goes on to say that it sort of drowned out, because it's on a Sunday, it drowned out church services, drowned out the choir or the organ. In fact, there's a scene, isn't there, in the film? And it tells a story of where there was a Salvation Army band happened to be playing, and they just stopped because they were drowned out by the... I mean, later, like the bomber formations right at the end of the war, like over Dresden or something like that. A big one, a massive one, would be 1,000 bombers. That's big. That was huge, isn't it? 1,000 bomber formation. Well, this is like 6,000, 3 times.
Yeah, that's impressive. Yeah,
it says even a few lines where it says the men themselves were sort of in awe of their own departure. Because even though they called them serials, even though these serials would take off at an unprecedented rate, one like every 30 seconds or something, or one a minute or something scarcely believable, despite that, they still had to circle around over places to all get in one lump before they head out across the North Sea over to Holland. Okay, so there's loads of stories about that, about the airlift. Also, I just start saying, because a big chunk of the book by Cornelius Ryan is telling sort of individual stories. Once we get into the action, it sort of stops talking in a broad sense about sort of grand strategy of World War II and starts talking about individual stories. So, I've picked out a fair few of them that I think are interesting, whip through a few. Because real life, we talked about this a little bit, didn't we, in one of the previous ones, about how sometimes when you drill down into history, the individual stories of weird, funny, odd things, human things, that's interesting in a different way.
I really enjoy going back to historic accounts. I believe I've talked to you before in an Epochs about Japanese accounts of first coming over to Europe and their perspective on things, and that's always pretty out there, but it's very novel and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and it brings it to life as well, And I think real life, the real individual stories of individual people, where they sometimes more bizarre than fiction, you know? Or it's like, if a screenwriter wrote that, you'd be like, it's a bit obvious, it's a bit weird, it's a bit on the nose, that would never happen, whatever. But when it's real life, it just is what it is. So, for example, there was one guy, Ginger Green, his name was. He decided to take a football with him. and someone said to him, "Why have you got a football?" And he said, "Well, when we're done, we can have a little kickabout on the heath, can't we?" Of course, anyone knows the story. That was never on the books.
I remember in the plane, I saw someone like it's almost like, you know how people have baby carriers and they have the baby in the front. They had a chicken in the film, which took me by surprise. I just imagined that's probably the highest a chicken's ever been at that point in human history.
Myrtle the Parachick to you. She's got a name. It's Myrtle.
Okay.
Myrtle the Parachick. Yeah, it's in the film. Sometimes they just hint at something. In the book, there's quite a few pages about Myrtle the Parachick. In fact, it's one of the few criticisms. Who am I to criticise Cornelius Ryan? But it's one of the few times I'm like, oh yeah, I get it. Yeah, what an odd thing. So there's this guy. What was his name? Glover. His name was. That's his surname. And for some reason, he had this pet chicken. Myrtle, the Parachick. And when he was training, this is an Englishman, he's in the first British Airborne, for whatever reason, he'd wear Myrtle, sort of like you say, on his chest, or in a bag on his shoulder, the book describes it more as. And he does practice jumps with her. And what he would do is a few dozens of feet above the ground, he would let her go. Because a chicken, although it can't fly, it can flutter down. It won't just fall like a stone. It will still flutter down. It'll be all right. So he trained her to do that. And then he took her on the actual live combat mission. And this Glover was a junior officer, and he had a Batman, what they call a Batman. It's basically your servant. Senior officers will have a servant, effectively, a Batman. And his Batman was... he said, look after her, make sure she's all right and things, and keep your eyes on both of us, because it's really important that Myrtle has a good war. It's so... again, if you wrote that, if you made that up, you'd be like, well, that's weird. Why have you made that weirdness up? And it's true, it's just a real thing. And you would think, why didn't his senior officers say, no, of course you're not taking a live chicken. Of course not.
I feel like it had been going on for so long. They were just like, oh, it's a good bit of fun, isn't it? Let them get on with it. That sort of attitude. Because the film does portray us British as being pretty blasé about everything. Like the Americans are shouting about stuff and panicking, and we're just like, oh, well, yeah, it's a bit inconvenient, isn't it? Oh, terrible. Jolly good show, though.
There's some great English bits in it. Englishness dialed up to 11.
Yeah. That's one of my favourite aspects of the film, to be honest, is that the showcases of those sorts of things, because you don't really see them too much anymore.
Yeah. One of my favourite bits in the whole film is when Anthony Hopkins, playing Major John Frost, has to commandeer a building to defend. Yeah. And now that's a really delicate thing, because you're essentially stealing someone's home, maybe all their property, and it may or may not get blown up or burnt down, and there's no appeal. You may or may not ever get any redress for that. So when you have to billet troops on someone, that's a thing. It's a big, serious, life-changing thing. And he knocks on the door and just says, "What does he say? Now listen here. I'm awfully sorry, but we're going to have to commandeer your house." It's just as simple as that. It's so English. It's great.
I also like when the place is full of soldiers. He's just like, "I'm awfully sorry about all of this."
Yeah. He has to apologise for the war. Yeah, it's great stuff. That was the other thing I was going to say about when we talk about Myrtle the Parachick. Spoiler alert, Myrtle doesn't make it out.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Myrtle, doesn't survive Operation Market Garden, unfortunately. It's terribly sad. But another example of that is where I think it's like there's no health and safety. None.
What is a war?
Or rather, I think that's the way it's always been, and it's just in modern times. And even when I was a little kid, in the 80s, so much less health and safety. You were responsible for yourself. If you slipped over and hurt yourself in McDonald's, no, you're not going to bring a case against McDonald's to give you loads of money. No, it's your responsibility to not fall over, for example. Anyway.
I'm pretty sure I've heard those exact words be uttered to me. It's your responsibility to not fall over.
All right, yeah. So well, we live in a very litigious society these days. But back in World War II, so here's an example where no senior officer said, no, you're not taking that chick. That's ludicrous for a number of reasons. He was just allowed to do it. Another one is, there's one great little story where there's a senior American officer up the front of one of the aeroplanes or one of the gliders, and it's being piloted by an English pilot. And he looks back down the aeroplane and he sees some of the paratroopers they're using a wood stove on the floor of the wooden plane. A lot of these, especially the gliders, they're made out of wood. And so he runs back there and goes, what are you doing? He said the heat coming off this thing was incredible. He says, what are you doing? You set fire to the floor. And we've got like bits of a howitzer back there and ammo. Like, what are you doing? That's crazy. And apparently the men just say, we're only brewing up a cup of tea. Calm down. Like, what's the problem? And so he goes back up front and says to the pilot, like, they're doing this incredibly dangerous thing. And apparently the pilot says, oh, don't worry about it and make sure I get a cup of tea when it's ready.
I knew that response was coming as well.
It's just so good. And I think the differences between the Americans and the English are shown up very well. For example, again, you've got sort of the Elliot Gould character. It's like this sort of brash, kind of rude, loud mouth.
Is he the guy with the cigar in his mouth at all times?
Yeah. He's Ross and Monica's dad in Friends.
Really?
Yeah, that's Elliot Gould. He's obviously a much younger man in 1977. But yeah, he's like this brash, tell those schmucks to get their ass in gear, you know. And where we're all like, well, I'm frightfully sorry, old boy. You know, it's very, the difference
stark,
between them, it's stark. It's a stark difference, yeah. But nonetheless, I mean, there's lots of examples, or there's one bit where they have, they show General Gavin losing his temper a bit, where the English are like, well, I suppose we can try and do that thing for you. And he's like, yeah, you can try, can't you? Because I think the English have got this sort of practiced, very, very practiced nonchalance, you know? It's one way to deal with the possibility of death, or not even death, but being horribly maimed, being burnt alive in your tank, or, you know, there's loads of terrible injuries in this. You know, people getting their eyes shot out or whatever, you know.
To borrow an American term, it's the stiff upper lip, isn't it? That's what that is. It's them looking at the prospect of death and kind of being indifferent about it. It's like, yeah, it could happen, could not. Out of my hands. Who cares?
I feel like there's this certain idea, don't see it much anymore these days, or very rarely, but if you are going to be asked to do something sort of insanely dangerous, like storm a beachhead or drop 60 miles behind enemy lines, you could allow the pressure and worry and fears overwhelm you, or you can be flippant about it. And it's just one way of dealing with it. And it just seems that, I mean, there's lots of examples here when Johnny Frost and his men at the bridge seem that all or nearly all is lost. They quite often break out in song. You know?
Yeah, I think it's very commendable, really. It's sort of laughing in the face of death. I think that's one of the most valorous traits a person can have.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, if you can't achieve great things and then be flippant about it, what's worth doing it for? I think that's a line, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's a line from like Oscar Wilde or something. There's no point in achieving anything great unless you can then be offhand about your achievement, right? I don't know, but maybe that's just a very English thing, you know, it's the opposite of sort of bling and showing off at all times, even when you haven't really got anything to show off about. The opposite of that, I think.
It's very un-English to do that.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.